They see your blindness, but they don't see your fire. Those prophetic words from a grandmother would echo through elite hallways before the most stunning 12-second takedown in high school history proved that the quiet girl everyone mocked was hiding 9 years of black belt mastery. When blind teenager Imani Carter endured racist bullying and viral mockery at prestigious Westfield Prep, nobody knew she was a second-degree martial artist whose patience had limits and whose capabilities would soon redefine everything they thought they knew about strength. What happens when privileged bullies push too far and systematic cruelty meets explosive self-defense? And how does a talent show kata performance become the perfect preview for justice served with surgical precision? Watch as viral humiliation transforms into viral vindication, while a courtyard confrontation exposes the dangerous mistake of judging people by their apparent vulnerabilities rather than their hidden fire. This is the story of how quiet dignity becomes unstoppable power when silence is no longer an option. Stay until the end to witness the most satisfying reversal of bullying ever captured, because sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones everyone assumes are helpless.
They see your blindness, but they don't see your fire. Those prophetic words from a grandmother to her granddaughter would echo through the hallways of Westfield Preparatory Academy before the most stunning reversal of power ever captured on high school security cameras proved that the most dangerous people are often the ones everyone assumes are helpless. Westfield Preparatory Academy sprawled across 43 acres of manicured Texas suburbia like a monument to inherited privilege, where the children of oil executives, tech entrepreneurs, and political dynasties received educations that cost more per year than most families earned. The Gothic Revival architecture and pristine athletic facilities whispered stories of generational wealth, while the student parking lot showcased BMWs and Mercedes that served as 16th birthday gifts rather than graduation rewards. Into this world of cultivated exclusivity walked Imani Carter, her white cane tapping rhythmically against Italian marble floors as she navigated corridors designed to intimidate rather than welcome. At 16, she possessed a quiet grace that transcended her modest circumstances, moving through the hostile environment with the patient dignity of someone who had learned early that survival required more than just academic excellence. It demanded the ability to remain composed while others tested the limits of human cruelty. The whispers began before she even reached her first class, floating through the halls with the casual malice that privileged teenagers perfect like a fine art. Diversity scholarship, came the coded language that reduced her presence to a checkbox rather than acknowledging her as a human being deserving of basic respect. Affirmative action case, added another voice, transforming her academic achievements into something unearned, rather than recognizing the extraordinary effort required to excel while navigating a world designed for sighted people. Medicine Whitmore, whose family name appeared on both the school's donor wall and several buildings throughout the campus, appointed herself as the unofficial gatekeeper of social hierarchies that determined who belonged in Westfield's rarefied atmosphere. Her perfectly highlighted blonde hair and designer uniform marked her as someone who had never questioned her right to occupy premium spaces, while her cruel blue eyes suggested an intelligence that had been twisted into weaponized superiority rather than genuine achievement. I heard her parents basically bought her way in with diversity points, Madison whispered to her circle of followers, her voice carefully calibrated to be just loud enough for Imani to hear while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. Like, how is that even fair to students who actually earned their spots here? Her boyfriend, Tanner McKenzie, possessed the particular brand of arrogance that comes from being a star athlete in a culture that worships physical dominance while ignoring character development. His Letterman jacket and perfectly sculpted physique had earned him the kind of social immunity that made him feel untouchable, while his casual cruelty toward anyone he perceived as weak revealed the emptiness behind his carefully maintained image. The most devastating aspect of Imani's situation wasn't the student's cruelty, it was the institutional indifference that enabled it to flourish unchecked. Teachers who witnessed the microaggressions chose comfortable blindness over confrontational justice, while administrators maintained the kind of willful ignorance that protects prestigious reputations at the expense of vulnerable students. But what none of them knew, what none of them could have guessed as they whispered their assumptions and crafted their hierarchies of worthiness, was that they were dismissing someone whose quiet exterior masked capabilities that would soon redefine everything they thought they understood about strength, power, and the dangerous mistake of judging people by their apparent vulnerabilities rather than their hidden potential. If you've ever been underestimated because of something that made you different, if you've watched someone endure cruelty with dignity that their tormentors couldn't recognize, hit that like button right now. Share your own story of being judged by your circumstances rather than your character, and subscribe to this channel because what happens next will prove that sometimes the quietest people possess the loudest power when the moment demands action.
Right at that moment, as Imani's quiet dignity became a target for Westfield's privileged predators, the universe was orchestrating the perfect test of character that would expose the true nature of everyone involved. What started as a routine class assignment would escalate into systematic cruelty that proved some people view kindness as weakness and difference as an invitation for abuse. The History Project assignment should have been straightforward: research the civil rights movement and present findings to the class. But when Mrs. Henderson announced the random pairings, Madison's theatrical groan made it clear that being partnered with Imani was being treated as punishment rather than opportunity. "Seriously?" Madison said, loud enough for the entire class to hear, her voice dripping with the kind of disdain that wealthy teenagers use to establish social hierarchies. "How am I supposed to work with someone who can't even see the research materials? This is so unfair." Mrs. Henderson's response revealed everything wrong with institutional indifference disguised as conflict avoidance. "Just try to get along, girls," she said, with the weary tone of someone who had chosen comfort over courage so many times that confronting injustice felt impossibly difficult. "I'm sure you'll figure out a way to make it work." But Madison had no intention of making anything work. During their first meeting in the library, she made her position crystal clear through a combination of deliberate exclusion and public humiliation designed to reinforce Imani's status as an unwelcome intruder in Madison's world. "Look, I'll just do the whole project myself," Madison announced, while scrolling through her phone rather than making eye contact. "You can put your name on it, but don't expect to actually contribute anything meaningful. I mean, how could you?" The cruelty escalated during passing periods when Tanner's casual violence added a physical dimension to the psychological warfare that Imani endured daily. His accidental collision with her cane sent her stumbling into a locker, while his mock apology carried undertones that made his intentions unmistakable. "Oops, thought it was a stick bug. Maybe you should get one of those seeing-eye dogs. At least then you'd have a friend." But it was at home, in the modest apartment she shared with her grandmother, that Imani found the wisdom and strength that would eventually transform her from victim to victor. Her grandmother, Rosa Carter, had survived decades of institutional racism with dignity intact, and her advice carried the weight of experience earned through battles fought and won in circumstances far more dangerous than high school hallways. "Baby," Rosa said, as she noticed Imani's shoulders carrying the weight of accumulated cruelty, "they see your blindness because that's all they choose to look at. They don't see your fire, your intelligence, your strength. But most importantly, they don't see what you've been learning in that dojo since you were 7 years old." The reminder of her martial arts training, 9 years of discipline, focus, and physical conditioning that had transformed her body into a weapon her tormentors couldn't imagine,
brought a slight smile to Imani's face. Her second-degree black belt represented more than just athletic achievement. It was proof that limitations existed only in the minds of people who lacked the vision and determination to transcend their circumstances. What Madison and Tanner didn't know was that they were systematically humiliating someone who had spent nearly a decade learning to fight in darkness, someone whose blindness had been transformed into strategic advantage through years of training that taught her to rely on senses they had never learned to develop.
No one expected what happened when Tanner's cruel mockery went viral, because sometimes the universe has a way of ensuring that private cruelty becomes public shame, and what started as hallway harassment would soon expose the toxic culture of privilege that Westfield Preparatory had spent decades protecting behind closed doors. The video that would change everything was filmed during lunch period in Westfield's main corridor, where Tanner decided to entertain his football teammates with what he considered a hilarious impression of Imani's daily navigation challenges. The performance was calculated and cruel. He closed his eyes, stumbled dramatically into walls, and flailed his arms while making exaggerated sounds of confusion and distress. "Look, guys, I'm Imani," he announced to his laughing audience, his voice pitched high in mock helplessness as he pretended to feel around desperately for direction. "Where am I? Help me, I can't see. Maybe if I feel around enough, I'll find some diversity points to help me graduate." The laughter that followed was the sound of privileged teenagers bonding over shared cruelty, their amusement serving as social currency that reinforced hierarchies built on the systematic dehumanization of anyone they perceived as different or vulnerable. Madison captured every moment on her phone, her perfectly manicured finger hitting the share button before Tanner had even finished his performance. Within hours, the video had spread beyond Westfield's insular community to become viral content that attracted the attention of social media users who recognized they were witnessing something far more sinister than teenage pranks. The comment section became a battlefield between people defending Imani's dignity and others who found Tanner's mockery entertaining. But the damage to Westfield's carefully cultivated reputation was immediate and irreversible. But the most devastating aspect of the situation wasn't the viral humiliation, it was the institutional response that revealed how deeply the school's leadership was invested in protecting perpetrators rather than victims. When Imani's guardian, her grandmother Rosa, demanded a meeting with Principal Matthews, his response epitomized everything wrong with elite educational institutions that prioritize donor relationships over student welfare. "Mrs. Carter," he said with the patronizing tone that administrators use when they want to appear sympathetic while avoiding actual responsibility. "Perhaps Imani would be more comfortable at a school that's better equipped to handle her special needs. Westfield has always prided itself on academic excellence, and sometimes that environment can be challenging for students who require additional accommodations." The suggestion that Imani was the problem rather than the victim revealed the toxic logic that allowed systematic abuse to flourish unchecked. Meanwhile, Jordan Phillips, a quiet biracial student who had witnessed months of harassment, struggled with his own complicity in Imani's isolation. His desire to speak up warred with his fear of becoming the next target, creating the kind of moral paralysis that enables cruelty to continue while good people remain silent. "I should say something," Jordan whispered to himself as he watched Imani endure another day of whispered insults and deliberate exclusion. But what if they turn on me next? His internal conflict represented the broader institutional failure that enabled bullying to thrive. The calculation that personal safety was more important than collective justice, that individual comfort mattered more than communal responsibility. What none of them understood was that Imani's quiet endurance wasn't submission, it was preparation. Every insult absorbed, every moment of humiliation endured, every instance of institutional betrayal was being cataloged by someone whose patience had limits and whose hidden capabilities would soon transform their assumptions about power, strength,
and the dangerous mistake of confusing silence with surrender.
But the tragedy had not stopped yet, because sometimes the universe orchestrates moments where victims must choose between passive endurance and active resistance. And what happened in Westfield's gymnasium would bring Imani to the breaking point while revealing the first glimpse of the fire her grandmother had warned others not to underestimate. Coach Williams announced the mandatory sparring exercise with the enthusiasm of someone who had confused physical education with entertainment, his voice echoing through the gymnasium as students gathered around the padded mats with the excited energy that comes from witnessing potential conflict. The fun sparring exercise was supposed to teach basic self-defense techniques, but in the toxic atmosphere that Westfield had cultivated, it became another opportunity for systematic humiliation disguised as educational activity. "All right, everyone, partner up for some light sparring," Coach Williams announced, his tone suggesting that he viewed the exercise as harmless fun rather than recognizing the potential for abuse that existed when power imbalances were ignored in favor of institutional convenience. Remember, this is about technique, not aggression. We're learning basic defensive moves, not trying to hurt each other. But Madison and Tanner had different intentions as they exchanged knowing glances and volunteered to partner with Imani, their eagerness revealing motivations that had nothing to do with educational objectives and everything to do with public humiliation. Their volunteer status was presented as generosity, two popular students willing to help the disabled new girl. But their smirks told a different story to anyone paying attention. "We'd be happy to help Imani learn some basic self-defense," Madison said with false sweetness that barely concealed her anticipation of what was about to unfold. "It's important for everyone to feel included, especially someone with her challenges." Coach Williams' response revealed the same institutional blindness that had allowed months of harassment to continue unchecked. "That's very thoughtful of you both," he said, completely missing the predatory undertones in their offer. "Let's go easy on her, though. We want this to be a positive learning experience for everyone." The condescension in his words hit Imani like physical blows, transforming what should have been an educational opportunity into another reminder that she was viewed as someone who needed protection rather than someone who deserved respect. But as she stood on the mat facing her tormentors, something shifted in her posture that should have served as a warning to anyone who understood body language and physical readiness. Her hands, which had spent months remaining gentle and non-threatening despite constant provocation, slowly formed fists that revealed calluses earned through years of dedicated training. Her breathing became controlled and measured, shifting from the shallow patterns of anxiety to the deep, centered rhythm that martial artists develop through thousands of hours of practice. Most significantly, her stance subtly adjusted from civilian casualness to something that suggested combat readiness, though the change was so subtle that only trained eyes would have recognized its significance. Madison approached with theatrical confidence, clearly expecting this to be another opportunity for public humiliation that would reinforce her social dominance while providing entertainment for their gathered classmates. "Don't worry, I'll be gentle," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, her voice carrying the mock concern that bullies use to disguise cruelty as kindness. But then something unexpected happened that would haunt Madison and Tanner for the rest of their time at Westfield. As Madison reached out to grab Imani's arm in what was supposed to be an easy takedown that would demonstrate her superiority, Imani's body began to move with a fluidity and precision that spoke of years of training that no one in that gymnasium could have imagined.
For just a moment, the fire that her grandmother had spoken about flickered in Imani's movements, a flash of speed, a hint of technique, a suggestion of power that transformed her from victim to something far more dangerous. Madison found herself off balance, confused by the resistance she had encountered, suddenly aware that the girl she had been tormenting possessed capabilities that didn't match her assumptions about helplessness and vulnerability. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the fire disappeared. Imani stepped back, her hands unclenching, her breathing returning to normal, her posture resuming the non-threatening stance that had defined her months at Westfield. "Not yet," she whispered, so quietly that only she could hear the words that would define her strategic patience. The moment of potential confrontation dissolved into anticlimactic disappointment for the gathered students, who had been expecting either spectacular failure or entertaining conflict. But Imani had made a choice that revealed wisdom beyond her years. She understood that timing matters more than capability, that the right moment for revelation would come when justice could be served rather than when anger demanded release. That evening, in the familiar safety of Master Chen's dojo, where she had trained since childhood, Imani sought guidance from the man who had taught her that martial arts was about more than physical technique. It was about understanding when strength should be revealed and when it should remain hidden. "Strength isn't in striking first, Imani," Master Chen reminded her, his words carrying the weight of decades spent teaching students the difference between power and wisdom. "Real strength is in knowing when the fight matters, when victory serves justice rather than just satisfying anger." His advice would prove prophetic, because the moment when the fight would matter was approaching faster than anyone could have imagined. If you've ever had to choose between standing up for yourself and waiting for the right moment to act, if you felt the weight of hidden strength while enduring public weakness, hit that like button right now. Share your thoughts on when patience becomes power, and subscribe to this channel, because what Imani does next will prove that sometimes the most devastating responses come from the quietest people when they finally decide that time for silence has ended.
Right at that moment, as Master Chen's words about timing and justice echoed in Imani's mind, the universe was preparing to provide the perfect stage for her hidden fire to finally emerge. What happened at Westfield's annual talent show would transform months of quiet endurance into the most stunning preview of power that the school had ever witnessed, though none of them would understand what they were really seeing until it was too late. The Westfield Preparatory Talent Show represented the pinnacle of the school's social calendar, where students competed not just for applause, but for the kind of recognition that could reshape social hierarchies and determine popularity rankings for the entire following year. The event was held in the school's state-of-the-art auditorium, complete with professional lighting and sound systems that rivaled Broadway theaters, because at Westfield, even student performances required the kind of production values that reflected the institution's commitment to excellence in all things. Madison had spent weeks preparing her dance routine, a technically proficient but emotionally vacant performance designed to showcase her flexibility and coordination while reinforcing her position as the school's undisputed queen of aesthetic perfection. Her routine had been choreographed by a professional instructor whose services cost more than most families spent on annual vacations, and her costume was a custom-designed creation that had been featured in several dance magazines. But the night before the talent show, something unexpected happened that would shift the entire dynamic of the competition. Imani appeared at the registration table during the final hour of sign-ups, her presence causing murmurs of confusion and anticipation among students who had assumed she would never voluntarily place herself at the center of attention. "I'd like to enter the talent show," she said simply to Mrs. Rodriguez, the drama teacher, who was coordinating the event. Her voice carried none of the nervous energy that typically characterized last-minute registrations, just the calm certainty of someone who had finally decided that the time for revelation had arrived. The rumors began immediately, spreading through Westfield's social networks with the velocity that only comes from privileged teenagers who have nothing better to discuss than the unexpected actions of someone they had dismissed as irrelevant. "What's she gonna do, read Braille?" became the most repeated question, accompanied by snickers and speculation about whether this was another diversity initiative designed to make everyone feel included, regardless of their actual talents. Madison's reaction was particularly telling, her confidence wavering for the first time since Imani's arrival at Westfield. "She's probably just doing some inspirational speech about overcoming obstacles," she told her friends with forced dismissiveness. You know, the kind of feel-good stuff that makes everyone clap but isn't actually impressive. But Tanner's response revealed deeper concerns about what Imani's participation might mean for the social order they had worked so hard to maintain. "He's trying to steal the attention from people who actually deserve it," he said, his voice carrying the particular anger that comes from people who sense their dominance being challenged in ways they don't understand. The night of the talent show, Westfield's auditorium filled with parents, students, and faculty members who had come expecting the usual display of inherited privilege disguised as individual achievement. Madison's performance went exactly as planned, technically competent, visually appealing, and utterly forgettable in the way that expensive mediocrity often is.
But when Imani's name was announced, something shifted in the auditorium's atmosphere that no one could have anticipated. She took the stage wearing simple black clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her white cane left backstage in a deliberate choice that immediately created tension among audience members who had grown accustomed to viewing it as her defining characteristic. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the announcement that would change everything. "Imani Carter will be performing a traditional martial arts kata, performed entirely without sight." The silence that followed was deafening as 400 people processed the implications of what they were about to witness. This wasn't going to be an inspirational speech or a demonstration of adaptive technology. This was going to be a physical performance by someone they had assumed was fundamentally limited by her disability. As the lights dimmed and rhythmic drum beats began to fill the auditorium, Imani moved to center stage with a fluidity that immediately commanded attention. Her movements began slowly, each gesture precise and deliberate as she initiated the kata that would reveal 9 years of hidden training to people who had spent months assuming they knew everything about her capabilities. What followed was 8 minutes of pure artistry that transformed the auditorium into a sacred space where physical mastery met spiritual discipline. Imani's body moved through complex sequences with the kind of precision that can only be achieved through thousands of hours of dedicated practice, her blindness becoming an advantage rather than a limitation as she demonstrated techniques that required internal focus rather than external vision. The audience watched in stunned silence as every assumption they had made about disability, limitation, and the relationship between physical ability and personal worth was systematically demolished by someone whose quiet strength had been hiding in plain sight for months. When the final movement ended and the lights returned to normal, the applause was thunderous but confused. People were clapping not just for the performance they had witnessed, but for the complete recontextualization of everything they thought they knew about the girl they had been dismissing. Madison and Tanner sat in their seats with expressions that revealed the dawning recognition that they had been systematically underestimating someone whose capabilities far exceeded their own, though their pride wouldn't allow them to admit the magnitude of their mistake.
No one expected what happened the next morning, because sometimes people respond to being humbled not with grace, but with desperate attempts to reassert dominance. And what Madison and Tanner orchestrated in Westfield's courtyard would prove that wounded pride can transform privileged bullies into something far more dangerous than casual cruelty. The talent show had ended with Imani's stunning kata performance earning a standing ovation that lasted nearly 3 minutes, but instead of inspiring respect or reflection, her demonstration of hidden capabilities had triggered something darker in her tormentors. Madison and Tanner spent the night crafting strategies to diminish what they couldn't deny, their wounded egos demanding revenge against someone who had dared to exceed their expectations while exposing their own mediocrity. "She memorized some dance moves. Big deal. Madison announced to anyone within earshot as students gathered in the courtyard during lunch period. Her voice carried the forced confidence of someone trying to convince herself as much as her audience. But the slight tremor in her tone revealed how deeply Imani's performance had shaken her sense of superiority. Tanner's response was more aggressive, his athlete's ego unable to process the reality that someone he had dismissed as weak possessed physical skills that made his football achievements look ordinary by comparison. "It's not like she actually fought anyone," he said, his voice growing louder as he worked himself into the kind of rage that precedes violence. "Waving your arms around in the dark doesn't make you tough." But what they didn't realize was that their public dismissal of Imani's abilities was being overheard by Jordan Phillips, who had spent months wrestling with his own complicity in her isolation and had finally found the courage to document what he suspected was about to become a confrontation that would define everyone involved. Jordan's phone was already recording when Imani entered the courtyard, her movements calm and purposeful as she navigated toward her usual quiet corner where she ate lunch alone. But Madison and Tanner had different plans for her afternoon, their wounded pride demanding a public confrontation that would reassert their dominance, while proving that her talent show performance had been meaningless theater rather than genuine capability. "Hey, Imani!" Tanner called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "That little show last night didn't impress anyone who matters. You think some memorized choreography makes you special?" The courtyard fell silent as students recognized the tone that preceded violence, their conversation stopping as they turned to witness what promised to be either entertaining conflict or devastating humiliation. Madison joined Tanner with the predatory energy of someone who had spent the night planning this moment, her designer manicure glinting as she prepared to physically assert the dominance that words had failed to maintain. "Let's see how brave you are without a stage and spotlights," Madison hissed, stepping close enough to Imani that their confrontation became intimate and inescapable. The physical proximity was calculated intimidation, designed to trigger the kind of panic response that would reduce Imani to tears and restore the social hierarchy that her performance had threatened.
But something had changed in Imani overnight, something that her tormentors were too blinded by their own assumptions to recognize. The months of patient endurance had been preparation rather than submission, and Master Chen's lessons about timing had finally aligned with circumstances that justified action rather than restraint. "I don't want any trouble," Imani said quietly, her voice carrying neither fear nor aggression, but something far more dangerous, the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and had already calculated the precise amount of force necessary to end it quickly. Tanner's response revealed everything wrong with privileged masculinity that confuses size with strength and aggression with courage. "Too bad, because trouble found you," he snarled, lunging forward with the clumsy confidence of someone who had never faced real resistance from anyone he had chosen to attack. What happened next lasted exactly 12 seconds, but those 12 seconds would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms as viewers witnessed the most perfect demonstration of why assumptions about disability, race, and gender can be catastrophically wrong when they collide with genuine expertise. Tanner's lunge was met with a response so swift and precise that most observers missed the individual movements that comprised Imani's defense. Her body flowed like water around his attack, redirecting his momentum, while her hands found pressure points that dropped him to the ground with surgical efficiency. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary force, just the clinical application of techniques that had been refined through years of training for exactly this type of confrontation. Madison's attempt to capitalize on the distraction by attacking from behind proved equally futile, her designer-manicured slap intercepted by someone whose hearing had been trained to detect threats from any direction.
Imani's counter was equally precise, a clean arm lock that brought Madison to her knees without causing permanent damage, just enough discomfort to end her aggression while demonstrating the vast gulf between their respective capabilities. The courtyard erupted in shocked exclamations as students processed what they had witnessed, their phones capturing every moment of a confrontation that had lasted less than 15 seconds, but had permanently altered every assumption they had made about power, strength, and the dangerous mistake of judging people by their apparent limitations. "She didn't even use her eyes," someone whispered in the stunned silence that followed, their voice carrying the awe that comes from witnessing something that challenges fundamental beliefs about what human beings are capable of achieving. Jordan's video captured everything: the build-up, the confrontation, and most importantly, the moment when two privileged bullies learned that their assumptions about superiority had been catastrophically wrong from the very beginning.
Right at that moment, as Madison and Tanner lay on the courtyard ground processing the reality that they had just been systematically dismantled by someone they had spent months dismissing as helpless, Jordan's finger hit the upload button that would transform a local school incident into a global phenomenon about justice, assumptions, and the dangerous price of underestimating people based on their apparent vulnerabilities. The video's journey from Westfield's courtyard to international headlines happened with the lightning speed that only occurs when content captures something profound about human nature and social justice. Within 6 hours, Jordan's recording had been shared over 50,000 times, with viewers adding commentary that ranged from celebration to outrage as they witnessed what many described as the most satisfying reversal of bullying they had ever seen. "Blind Black Teen Stuns Racist Bullies with Martial Arts Mastery" became the headline that dominated news cycles across multiple platforms. But the story's impact extended far beyond viral entertainment into serious discussions about disability rights, institutional racism, and the systemic failures that allow harassment to flourish in educational environments that prioritize reputation over student welfare. The comment sections became battlegrounds where viewers debated everything from martial arts technique to the broader implications of how society treats people with disabilities. But the overwhelming response was admiration for Imani's restraint, precision, and the months of dignified endurance that had preceded her moment of justified self-defense. But the real consequences began to unfold in the physical world, where actions have lasting impacts on lives and careers. Tanner's football scholarship to Texas A&M, which had been his pathway to college education and potential professional athletics, was suspended pending a behavioral review that examined not just the courtyard confrontation, but months of documented harassment that the viral video had brought to public attention. "We cannot, in good conscience, provide scholarships to students whose behavior reflects poorly on our institution's values," announced Coach Morrison in a press conference that was broadcast across Texas sports networks. "Athletic ability does not excuse moral character deficiencies, and Mr. McKenzie's actions represent everything we stand against as an educational institution." Madison's consequences were equally devastating, though they arrived wrapped in her parents' attempts to blame external forces rather than acknowledging their daughter's fundamental character flaws. The Whitmores withdrew Madison from Westfield within 72 hours of the video going viral, but their public statements revealed the same toxic mindset that had created their daughter's behavior in the first place. "This is what happens when woke culture infiltrates our educational institutions," Mrs. Whitmore declared in a Facebook post that was screenshotted and shared thousands of times as an example of how privilege responds to accountability. "Our daughter is being punished for defending herself against someone who was clearly trained to hurt other students. This is reverse discrimination at its worst."
But the Whitmores' attempts to reframe Madison as the victim fell flat in the face of overwhelming video evidence and testimony from dozens of students who came forward with their own stories of harassment, discrimination, and institutional indifference. The viral attention had created a safe space for truth-telling that revealed Westfield's toxic culture extended far beyond individual bullies into systemic problems that demanded comprehensive reform. The school board faced unprecedented public pressure as parents, civil rights organizations, and disability advocacy groups demanded investigations into how months of documented harassment had been allowed to continue without intervention. Principal Matthews, whose suggestion that Imani might be more comfortable elsewhere, had been captured in recorded conversations, announced his resignation amid calls for criminal charges related to his failure to protect students under his care.
But perhaps the most significant transformation belonged to the broader conversation about disability, capability, and the assumptions that society makes about people whose differences are visible rather than hidden. Imani's story became a case study in martial arts academies, disability rights organizations, and educational institutions seeking to understand how to better serve students whose potential had been systematically underestimated. The scholarship offers began arriving within days, not just from martial arts academies impressed by her technical skills, but from universities recognizing her as someone whose character, intelligence, and resilience represented everything they wanted in their student bodies. The National Federation of the Blind offered her a platform to speak about disability rights, while several major corporations reached out about internship opportunities that recognized her leadership potential. Most significantly, Imani found herself invited to address congressional hearings about bullying prevention and disability rights in educational settings, her testimony carrying the weight of lived experience that academic studies couldn't match. Her appearance before the House Education Committee was broadcast live, reaching millions of viewers who needed to hear her message about the cost of institutional indifference and the potential that exists in every person when given genuine opportunity and respect. What happened to me at Westfield wasn't just about individual bullies, she testified, her voice carrying across the packed hearing room with the authority of someone whose experience had earned her the right to speak truth to power. It was about a system that teaches students it's acceptable to dehumanize people who are different and adults who choose comfort over courage when confronted with injustice. The ripple effects extended beyond individual consequences into policy changes that would protect future students from experiencing what Imani had endured. The Imani Carter Anti-Bullying Act was introduced in Texas legislature, mandating specific training for educators about disability harassment and creating federal funding for schools that implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination programs. But for all the national attention and policy implications, the most meaningful moment came when Jordan approached Imani in Westfield's hallway, his own transformation from silent bystander to courageous documenter having earned him the respect of someone whose friendship was worth more than any social media following. "I should have spoken up sooner," he said, his voice carrying genuine remorse for months of complicity disguised as self-preservation. Imani's response revealed the grace that had sustained her through the darkest moments, while pointing toward a future where such conversations might not be necessary. "You spoke up when it mattered most," she said simply. "That's what courage looks like, not the absence of fear, but action despite fear." The revolution had begun, and its impact would extend far beyond one high school in Texas to touch every institution where power protected privilege at the expense of human dignity.
Right at that moment, as congressional testimony and national recognition transformed Imani from victim to voice, the universe was preparing to deliver the most beautiful completion of her journey through the simple act of walking into a new school where her reputation had preceded her and respect was waiting instead of requiring battles to achieve.
3 months after the viral video had reshaped national conversations about bullying and disability rights, Imani stood at the entrance of Austin Arts Academy, a progressive institution that had recruited her not despite her blindness, but because of the extraordinary character she had demonstrated under pressure. The contrast with her first day at Westfield could not have been more profound. Instead of whispers about diversity quotas, she was greeted by students and faculty who understood they were in the presence of someone whose courage had inspired policy changes across the country. Jordan walked beside her, no longer the silent bystander who had struggled with moral paralysis, but a confident young man whose documentary about their shared experience at Westfield had earned him admission to several prestigious film programs. Their friendship had been forged in the crucible of institutional injustice, but it had evolved into something deeper, a mutual respect between two people who had learned that standing up for what's right often requires personal courage that extends beyond individual comfort zones. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Jordan observed as they approached the main building, his voice carrying the wonder of someone experiencing educational environments designed around inclusion rather than exclusion. Imani's response revealed how profoundly her perspective had been shaped by months of advocacy work and public speaking that had taken her from congressional hearings to United Nations conferences on disability rights. "It feels like what school should have always been," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone whose pain had been transformed into purpose. The symbolic moment came when she reached into her backpack and pulled out the headphones that had served as her armor during the darkest days at Westfield, the noise-canceling barrier that had protected her from the constant stream of cruelty and casual racism that had defined her previous educational experience. With deliberate ceremony, she placed them in her locker, leaving them behind like a snake shedding skin that no longer served its purpose. "I don't have to block the world out anymore," she announced to Jordan, her words carrying the liberation of someone who had moved from defensive survival to proactive engagement with environments that welcomed rather than merely tolerated her presence. The transformation was immediately apparent in how faculty and students interacted with her throughout that first day. Mrs. Patterson, her new history teacher, approached their first class discussion by asking Imani to share insights from her congressional testimony about historical patterns of institutional discrimination, treating her lived experience as expertise rather than burden. "Miss Carter," Mrs. Patterson said with genuine respect, "your testimony before the House Education Committee provided perspectives that our textbooks simply can't capture. Would you be willing to share some of those insights with the class?" The request represented everything that had changed. Instead of being seen as someone who needed accommodation, she was being recognized as someone whose unique perspective offered valuable contributions to collective learning. But the most powerful moment came during lunch period when a group of younger students approached her table with expressions that mixed admiration with curiosity. Among them was a shy Latino boy with a visible physical disability who had clearly been inspired by her story to see his own differences as potential strengths rather than inevitable limitations.
"Miss Carter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I saw your video and your speeches. I wanted to thank you for showing us that being different doesn't mean being less than." Imani's response captured everything she had learned about power, representation, and the responsibility that comes with platforms earned through suffering transformed into service. "Being different means seeing the world in ways that other people can't," she said, her voice carrying the authority of lived experience. "That's not a limitation, that's a superpower." As the camera pulled back to show Austin Arts Academy's inclusive environment, where diversity was celebrated rather than merely tolerated, Imani's voiceover provided the perfect conclusion to a journey that had begun with cruelty and ended with transformation that extended far beyond individual victory. They saw a blind girl who didn't belong in their world,
Her voice carried over images of students from every background working together in an environment that valued difference as strength. What they didn't see was someone who already knew how to fight in the dark, someone whose blindness had taught her to see things that sighted people miss, someone whose fire had been waiting for the right moment to illuminate not just her own path, but pathways for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The final frame showed Imani walking confidently through hallways where her white cane was just another tool rather than a source of shame, where her identity was defined by her character rather than her disability, where the fire her grandmother had recognized was finally burning bright enough to light the way for others following behind her. She had never needed their permission to be extraordinary. She had simply needed the moment when hiding was no longer necessary, and her light could finally shine without apology.
Here's the truth that Imani Carter taught us without ever raising her voice. In a world that judges capability by appearance, the most transformative power belongs to those who understand that real fire burns quietly until justice demands illumination. Imani's story reveals something profound about hidden strength. Madison and Tanner made the fatal error of confusing blindness with helplessness, quietness with weakness. But Imani understood what they never learned. The most dangerous person in any confrontation is often the one everyone assumes has no power, because they've had years to develop capabilities others can't imagine. What makes her victory so powerful is that she didn't just defend herself, she transformed institutional systems that had failed countless others. Her restraint during months of harassment wasn't weakness, it was wisdom about when violence serves justice and when patience serves a greater purpose. The lesson extends beyond bullying or martial arts. Every day we encounter people whose true potential is hidden behind circumstances we don't understand, whose silence might be strategy rather than submission. Imani's 9 years of training remind us that strength often develops in darkness, and real capability doesn't announce itself with boasting. Madison and Tanner's downfall proves that privilege without character is self-destructive, and that viral justice ensures private hatred becomes public accountability. Their assumption that differences meant vulnerability became the foundation for their own humiliation. But the most important lesson is about responsibility that comes with hidden strength. Imani's fire didn't burn to destroy enemies. It burned to light pathways for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong or weren't worth defending. If this story reminded you that strength comes in forms society doesn't always recognize, if it inspired you to look deeper than appearances, hit that like button right now. Share your experiences with hidden strength in the comments. I read every story, and your experiences inspire my content. Subscribe for more stories that prove the most dangerous people are often the ones everyone assumes are helpless, because sometimes the quietest fire burns brightest when justice demands light.